request for proposals early in 21 and received proposals from leading consultants for broadband across the nation. A selection committee was formed both to look at the business side of the proposals, but also the technical side. And at the end of that proposal evaluation, it was agreed that Finley Engineering CCG Consulting was definitely the best consultant to pursue our study. That was endorsed by our board of directors, and we proceeded on with a contract and work with Finley. I think we would be remiss if we did not mention that this study was made possible by the financial participation of many in Door County, and I'd just like to take a moment to express appreciation to those contributors. Certainly the County of Door, the town of Liberty Grove, the town of Sebastopol, the town of Bailey's Harbor, the town of Egg Harbor, the town of Brussels, the town of Jacksonport, Washington Island Electric Cooperative, the town of Sturgeon Bay, the town of Clay Banks, the school district of Sturgeon Bay, and the Southern Door County School District. And for our private and nonprofit contributors, of course, the DCEDC, Renard's Cheese and Rosewood Dairy, Door County Medical Center, and the Raybrook Foundation. We owe a debt of gratitude to all those who supported this study. I'd like now to introduce the principals that were involved with this study, Dean Mitschke from Finley Engineering, and Doug Dawson with CCG Consulting. So guys, I think Doug, you're going to make the presentation and we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Steve. We're actually both going to make the presentation. I'm going to get it started here. Let me first share my screen. So as Steve said, we are Finley Engineering and CCG Consulting. We have done, our two firms over the last 3 or 4 years have probably done maybe 35 or 40 of these studies together. We've both been around in the industry a long time. This is my firm's 25th year. Finley Engineering's been here since the 50s, so they got me beat on that one. So Steve already talked about the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study was to really find out what the real issues were and to be able to quantify them. The goal here was to come out with all the things that you would need to go and implement a broadband solution. So we've, the cost of a network, how many people, what's the real situation with speeds, all those kind of facts that you need in order to go get grants and build business plans. And so we also answered a whole long list of questions, that Steve had posed to us, everything from regulatory stuff, talked about seasonality and just a long list of issues. And so altogether, I forget the exact number, but it's around a 200-page report. It's quite comprehensive, and I would hope that at least 1 or 2 of you may have read it by now. So I know the folks on the broadband committee did. We got lots of great comments back on it. So let's talk about the study. This part here is just basic stuff. We know there's 3 telephone companies in the county, and AT&T announced in October of 2020 that they're not connecting any new DSL customers. So for all practical purposes, they're bowing out of the market. So if our understanding is, even if your circuit breaks, they won't fix you. I mean, the fact is they're trying to sort of get people off of that product. Charter Spectrum is the incumbent in all these towns listed here, and not just in the town limits, but also in the outskirts and around the towns. Door County Broadband, Mercury Networks, and Sonic Net are fixed wireless providers. We also found a lot of residents using satellite broadband, a lot of people using cellular broadband, and a lot of people just using cell phones because that's the only thing that would work in their home. So we got a real cross mix of people using different technologies. We started by reaching out to the public. We wanted to find out all about the broadband usage. And so we ended up doing separate surveys for residences and businesses. We did online speed tests. We also interviewed key stakeholders. And as you might expect, those three things really let us dig a lot deeper into what's going. These are all things that you guys probably already know, but we, in order to give you the best answer, we had to catch up and really understand what was going on in the county. The survey results were interesting. 17% of houses said they can't get broadband. It's actually 11% say they can't get it at all. The other 6% say they can't get anything worth buying. But still, that's 17% of houses that say they really have no broadband alternative. 81% of residents supported building a fiber network. Another 18% said they needed more facts, so they might support the idea. So that's very overwhelming support. And in fact, everybody we talk to is really wanting better broadband. I mean, this is so universal across the board. We do, again, all these studies, I've probably done 450 of these over my career. And I don't know that I've ever been in a county where there was just an outcry for it. 87% of the survey respondents wanted faster speeds. 83% wanted more competition, which is another way almost of saying the same thing. 76% were worried about reliability, and 60% wanted lower prices. You know, when broadband's a little okay, prices is usually the top issue. When we see that it's speeds and reliability and competition, you know, that really talks about the poor quality of the broadband in a lot of the county. 62% said they would buy from a new fiber network. Another 23% said they would probably buy. Those are gigantic numbers. I mean, that's just an overwhelming set of numbers. The businesses who were served in the towns by charter said they were okay with broadband, but every single one of them still had issues with reliability and upload speeds. And they all talked about how broadband deteriorated during the tourist season. So they'd say, well, half the year our broadband's great, and then it kind of gets slow again. And I'm sure all of you know that. The people who were not in those towns really struggle with broadband. The inns and hotels don't have the broadband that their visitors want. Some of the retail stores, the broadband is so bad that they can't even process credit cards. And credit card processing is the smallest amount of data you can almost do. It's a very tiny data stream. When you can't do that, you have the worst possible broadband. I mean, the only other places I've run into that in the last year are like in the desert of New Mexico. So, I mean, that's really bad broadband when we have that problem. Every business we talked to, including the ones in the town, did have a list of things that if they had really good broadband that they could do better. So, you know, that alone is a really important finding, we think. So the speed tests, we did our own set of speed tests, and we also mixed them in because the state of Wisconsin has been gathering speed tests from M Labs. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump straight to the table here, because this is a really interesting table. And this is probably the best, maybe the best story of the whole report to explain what's going on. As you can see here, all the ISPs who were in the speed test are on the left. The technology that each of them uses in the second column. The third column is the number of tests that we had for each and the various speed tests. As you can see then, on the last two columns are the average download speeds and the average upload speeds. Charter is the only one who has speeds that are faster than the FCC definition of broadband, which is 25.3, 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. So Charter matches that speed. What's a little, you know, but still, that's not a great number. We do communities where we see Charter averaging 90 and 100 and 110. And so that means, and when you start looking into detail of those readings, which we did, there's a lot of people who are getting pretty slow speeds even on Charter. There's a lot of people in the 20 and 30 megabit range. And so that told us the second thing, which is the speeds are not consistent. And that sort of talks about at least parts of their network are older, or they might be configured in an old way, something we call cascading. But there's, you know, we can't look at Charter and say that they're consistent. They have different performance in different parts of the network. Everybody else is not even close to 25 megabits download. The upload speeds, the only other one who was above the 3 megabits is AT&T. Everybody else was really slow. And in saying that, 25.3 is not good broadband. It's very likely this year that the FCC is going to increase that definition to 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up. Under that test, you know, nobody here has good broadband. Now that's not true. Remember, these are average numbers. There are some customers on Charter getting, 300, 500 megabits. There's some customers getting really good speeds, but this is putting everybody together. This is also a lot of readings. I mean, this is a lot of speed tests. So again, the average for everybody except Charter, if you put everybody else in a pool, is 6 megabits down, 2 megabits up. That is probably the easiest way to talk about why everybody else is so unhappy with their broadband. So the pandemic highlighted the upload broadband crisis. The problem with upload speeds, that's what you need to connect to school, to connect from home, to be sitting on this video call tonight. And one person can get by with those 3 or 4 megabit speeds we saw there, but as soon as you have multiple people in the house using it, you need a much larger amount of upload speed. And in the county, it's just not there. 11% said that they have absolutely no reasonable broadband option at their house. Around a lot of the country, people at least can get satellite broadband because of the trees and stuff there. A lot of people can't even get that. So there were just a lot of people who were really frustrated. Everybody said, including there are some customers on fiber in the towns in a few places. Even those fiber customers said they bogged down during the tourist season. I'm going to hand it over to Dean here to talk about the network design, and I'll be back to talk about the numbers after him. So if you want to go, Dean.
Thank you, Doug, and good evening to the audience. I appreciate the opportunity to participate with this. I'm an engineer. I like digging into the nuts and bolts, and you'll be thrilled to know I'm not going to do that for this. I'm going to keep it pretty high level and instead try to just get across some of the largest concepts. And whenever we look at a design for a county, you cover a pretty good sized area, and we take a look at where do the dollars go? What are your largest investments? How long does it last? And probably more important than a lot of studies, we spend a lot of time looking forward. And so we did our work not based on what is today, but where is it headed? And Doug's already talked about some of the uses and content creations and what have you, and definition of broadband as it's moving forward. The current grants coming out today are requiring that if an area has less than the 120, they're considered eligible for the grant, whereas in the beginning of this year, it was 25.3. So that decision, I think, is going to be what's going forward. So next slide. One of the things that I wanted to touch on here, and this was asked as part of the RFQ, is everybody talks about wireless, and it's going to be the next savior, and it's going to solve all of the problems. There's a lot of things with wireless that is fantastic and wonderful, and we do a lot of work within the wireless realm, but it has its place and its uses. Probably the key thing to remember when people talk to you about wireless is the bandwidth they're talking about is going up, but it's a physics thing. And as far as we know right now, a lot of people have had a hard time beating physics, but as you go up in speed, your distance goes down. And by the time you get to the point where you start talking about gigabit speeds on wireless, your distances are down into the hundreds of yards to maybe 1,000 yards at most, and that's being pretty optimistic. For you, the trouble is even worse because of your topography with the trees and everything else. So if we look at most typical areas, usually the wireless providers are the providers with the lowest quality of service simply because of all the barriers they face. It's expensive to upgrade, and the terrain just knocks their signal down so bad. They would have to have towers everywhere. The other part of it is that if we take a look at what really drives wireless, and that's fiber connectivity. So if you've got to get fiber to within 1,000 feet of every house, what's the point of going wireless the rest of the way? You can almost make it to the last bit of the house and get a network that won't suffer through upgrade issues. Some of the numbers, there's approximately 1,500 miles of fiber that would be required to build out the entire county. If we eliminated the areas that are currently being served by Charter, we're down to about 1,100 miles. So next slide. Next slide, Doug.
I'm trying. There goes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Right there. Yep. So when we look at what's the major costs in the network, it's called the optical distribution network, or the fiber that runs down the road past your house. It's about 80% of the capital expenditures. Lifespan, the manufacturers will state it's a 40-year lifespan, but in reality, it's probably going to last longer than that. And it's the most disruptive part of the project. We're in essence messing in everybody's front yards and going to the house. And so of all the things that we do in deploying a fiber network, this probably gets the most attention because it's so invasive to a person's property. Although the techniques have gotten so much better that even in buried portions, they can go ahead and put fiber to the house, and 4 or 5 days later or a month later, you'd never know where it was. So next slide. So one of the things we look at with a network is what's the most economical way to reach every customer. Theoretically, the ideal solution is we would take a fiber directly to every customer from the data center. The problem we run into that is the cables get very large and even for fiber, and very expensive. So typically what's done in an area as large as your area is we set up what's called a local convergence cabinet, where we bring the fibers that run individually to every establishment back to a point, and then from there we consolidate that traffic and bring it back on a much thinner cable back to the data center. In the case of Door County, we have approximately 70 some convergence centers, our convergence cabinets placed throughout the county, with about 35, I think, if I remember correctly, electronic sites. And that convergence center could be what's called, could be active electronics that would feed the customer from that point, or the convergence center could actually be a passive optical splitter. The easiest way to think about it is you run a light down the fiber, and you literally take a mirror and you reflect parts of it off into the other cables. And so you subdivide one fiber into 32 or 64 as a common denominator. If you want to give a click here, Doug, the one advantage that this local convergence cabinet does is you get a subdivision that pops up in the middle of nowhere. You can now serve a fairly large number of establishments by putting in another local convergence center. So if you want to click again, Doug, one too many, there you go. And that then allows you to continue to handle growth without having to build all the way back to the data center. And that part is huge. Next slide. So key design points we look at is the fiber network will have to follow the existing utilities. Your area is so rocky and with hills and everything else, and just tough going, that all of it's going to be put on the poles for the most part. I think the ratio of aerial to buried within your county was about 75 to 85% aerial and just a small percentage buried. And most of those are in the small subdivisions where they've just bit the bullet and went buried. You're going to hear a lot of people fight whether it's active or passive, and that basically means whether the fiber, that local convergence cabinet, has electronics in it or just a passive splitter. I will tell you that people argue vehemently one way or the other, and what I would say is that when we did this, we looked at what the industry is doing, where the money is being spent, and we decided to use PON. What we're seeing is that 10 gigabit PONs are available today that's shared across anywhere from 32 to 64 customers. And some manufacturers have already got 25 gigabit PON out and running, and 100 gig is on the horizon. So we see a tremendous growth in capacity in that. And the biggest thing that I would say is the network is designed to be agnostic. It can go active or PON or run both over the same fiber. And the reasons we did that was we wanted to make sure that your network was future proof. So I would dare say that with the exception of some minor additions to capacity, the fiber will provide continuing level of growth without having to be junked or pulled out or retired from service. I think the only reason you will see the fiber retire from service is if it's ever damaged or it literally plastic rots away, and that's a long ways down the road. In your network, we were able to supply it with one data center, and we would use redundant routes to connect to the outside world. And then we've obviously provided room for expansion. Next slide. This is just a rough idea of how we tackled a problem this big. We took the entire county and we broke it up into much smaller areas. And you can see the red lines that represent each of these areas. Next slide. From there, we had somebody go out on site. The person that was out on site has 40+ years of experience in our industry. And every one of these green dots that you see is where he stopped, looked at the existing conditions of the aerial, since that's where we're going to be attaching to, and noted whether there was room on the aerial, or if we had to do what's called make ready and in essence create room, either by replacing the poles or sliding somebody up or down to create a spot. So we literally covered the entire county with the exception of Washington Island. And the slide on the picture on the right just shows you a little bit greater view of that. So next slide. We then took and designed the ponds, we call them, serving areas in yellow, which were selected for several reasons. One of which is that some of them had unique issues that we had to deal with. And some of them were very similar to what we found throughout the rest of the network. We then took the yellow ones and we matched them up to the ones that are not highlighted in yellow to say that, okay, for example, if you look across the row, you'll see Gardner West was paired with Gardner West, obviously, but above it, Gardner North was paired to Bailey Central because that best matched the conditions that we saw in Gardner North as compared to Gardner West. And so as a statistical model, we designed 10% of the network and then extrapolated that out across the rest of the areas. Next slide. In the areas that we designed, we went down to, this is a very, it's still what we consider a high level design, but it is still very detailed because we went down to the very level of where the cables would be routed, which poles it attached to, and the route we would take to get to every establishment within that area. So you have the little white square in the center of the screen here. If you go to the next slide, here's the level of detail we went to, showing each pole we would attach to as we made the path down the routes to get to the individual houses. Now, obviously, we didn't go out and actually field verify that all of these are possible, but on average, our experience has shown that a build of this area probably would vary almost nothing from what we have designed in terms of how the route would be completed in this area. Next slide.
And this comes back to me.
Comes back to you.
All right. So what does that all mean? Well, it means some really big numbers is what it means. And so again, what we did here was, and something Dean didn't talk about, which is important to say, is because he broke the study down into all those pieces, we can come down and break the cost down for you in any of those combinations. We can also mix and match those, cut them in half. And so you actually have a very detailed design for the whole county. But here at this level, we just rolled them all up. So on the first column is the whole county numbers. Here's what it would cost to build every single home and business in the county, $130 million. As Dean said, it's mostly fiber. The second most expensive thing is drops. The electronics, which is an awful lot of the electronics are the ones sitting at the side of each house or business or inside each house or business. There's the huts, those cabinets Dean was talking about. And then operational assets are vehicles, computers for employees, it's just all those kind of things, spare equipment, inventory, all the things it takes to run a fiber business. So all those together add up to $130 million. There was 27,600 potential customers that the network was passing. That's a combination of all the homes and businesses and apartments. It's everybody. And for apartments, that's apartment units. So it's not buildings. And so that comes down to $4,700 per passing. To look at the rural areas then was $76 million, all the same items. And that turns out to be, as you would imagine, it's not as dense. It turns out to be $5,900, almost $6,000 a passing. We sometimes see that rural number a lot higher than that. I just finished working on a study today where the cost per passing was $11,000 in the rural area. Your rural area is still somewhat densely populated. Because of the terrain, a lot of people live along certain roads. And so versus in some parts of the country, where things are into a square grid, people are more spread apart. And so those are, as soon as we saw those numbers, before we went any further, we go, there's going to be ways to make this work. When the numbers get really big, the cost per passing, we start to sweat about how the heck we're going to pay for it. But those numbers made us feel like we already knew there was going to be some solutions. Next thing, the really important question that I think was right in the RFQ was, well, how much grant are we going to need? Because that's we knew right from before we even started, Steve knew we were going to need grants. We all know that you can't build a rural area without grants. And so this is a very high level condensed summary. There's way more detailed business plans behind all these numbers. But what this is showing you is the amount of money you need is directly in proportion. The biggest variable that matters is the number of customers on the network. And so if I only think I'm going to get 45% of the customers, I need a much larger grant than if I think I'm going to get 65% of the customers. It turns out in this county, it's always a balancing act when you go to ask for grant money because you don't really know how many you're going to get. But that survey and all of the talking we did to people and all the people on your broadband committee, I mean, everyone believes you would get a lot of customers. It's not going to be at the 45% number. I mean, you're never going to be that far off. Now, these are all break-even grants. You would never get that. Literally, what that number means, the very top number, it said if you got 45% of the customers in the county and you had a $41 million grant, after 20 years, you would just barely break even, but you would always have cash in the bank. Well, you're not going to talk an ISP into coming and doing all this work and making zero profit over 20 years. So the actual grants that they would look at, for most of these cases, will probably be $4 or $5 million higher than these numbers. So these are the break-even numbers. But as you can see, as we get to the higher penetration rates, we don't need that much grant. It's still a big number. And let's not pretend it's not. $11 million is a lot of grant. Add another 5 to that, we're talking $17, $18 million. And this was for just the rural area. Here's the same numbers for the total county area. The grants are actually smaller for the total county area because some of the city areas don't need grants at all. I mean, they stand alone if somebody wanted to build there. The issue for the city, though, is in the towns, you never expect you're going to, in their areas where nobody has broadband, the nationwide penetration rate of broadband is 87%. We would never predict that you're going to get 87%, but in the rural areas, you're going to get a pretty high number. And we do have clients who get that high of a penetration rate. But most of the rural areas that we've helped build over the last 5 years are getting up to over 70, and some of them even 75, and a few of them above 80, one of them above 90 that we work with. But the towns, you don't do that well. I mean, there's a lot of people who are not unhappy with Comcast. And so, here we looked at 45, 50, and 55% for the whole county to really pull those numbers down. This showed at 55%, you don't need any grants. If you could raise all the money to build this, you could build the whole county with no grants. But that's a lot of money to raise. I mean, that's a big old, that's the assets is 133 million. So seasonality is a real big issue in the county. So, so those numbers I just showed you do not include seasonality. And the reason for that is, the real question you're going to have to ask yourself is really a policy question, because a lot of seasonal communities, I just finished a whole lot of studies out on Cape Hatteras in Massachusetts. And the question they asked was, who are we building this thing for? Are we building it for the people who live here? Or are we building it for the tourists? And the answer is you're building it for both, but the question is who's going to pay for it? And it's the people who live there who are going to pay for it. And so a lot of communities who are seasonal don't give discounts to the partial year people. They go, look, if you want on this network, you got to pay your full share. Otherwise it costs the rest of us too much money. There are other communities that decide that seasonality is important, and they give them, half the year they give them free broadband. And so we, we looked at it both ways. I quantified, if for half the year you gave 30% off to customers, that adds another $6 million to the rural grants. It adds $12 million to the grants for the whole county. So that the numbers on that prior page would be a heck of a lot higher if you decided you were going to do have seasonal rates. And that's why, people always go, how much grant do I need? And the answer is, well, it depends how you decide to run the business. There's other issues that also affect the amount of grants, but the number of customers and the seasonality were the two big drivers of the size of the grants in this county. So, but there are other issues. The interest rates drive it some. Loan terms, 30-year loans, 25-year loan, 20-year loan, they make a difference. Prices make a big difference. The prices I have in here started where the cheapest product was $60. In your county, that's already a bargain today for most people. So that was, to us, that was actually a little bit under average. The survey showed us that the average folks today who have broadband are paying somewhere just above $70. So 60 is actually a very good price. And then, the cost of the network is important. Believe it or not, that, the 130 million is the least important number in here at the point where we got to figure out the amount of grants. It's important, but it doesn't drive the numbers as much as the other things. And so one of the things before any ISP builds this, they would start pinning down these numbers. What's the interest rate I can borrow at? That they can put a real number there. What kind of loan terms can I get? So once you start putting real numbers in these things, the business plan gets more and more finely tuned. What are my prices? Let's set them and we're done with it. That's not going to vary anymore. And so, but in study, I varied all of these things just to see how they would change the answer. And so any ISP decides to do that, are going to find my sensitivity tables very interesting because they do the same thing. So when they do their analysis. Grant funding obviously is the big thing. I haven't changed this slideshow since November. In November, when we put this slideshow out, it said the Congress had just passed the bill. I think it passed a week before we did this slide. But it's called BEAD, BEAD grants. It's the giant $42.5 billion it's coming. That grant's going to be, actually the money will be given to the state to distribute around the state. But the NTIA, which is a federal agency, is going to set the rules for it. But then the state's going to actually decide who wins the grant funding. And so that we don't know the dates yet, because right now what's happening are the states have to file a broadband plan with the NTIA, who has to approve it. We're guessing at earliest that these grants might be due in October. Nobody knows, but sometime this summer we'll start finding out when all of this is going to happen. That's the one that you don't want to miss. Steve and I are going to talk about next steps. That's if we need to get an ISP lined up to go after those grants. That's the place you're likely going to get this funded. You do have, all of you have some ARPA money. That's the money that came out of the earlier stimulus plan. Every city, the county, townships, the state, everybody got this money. That is a huge amount of money. Nationwide, that was $350 billion. That money can be used for broadband. I know that some of the towns are already looking at that here in the city or in the county. There's also other grants. There's a capital projects fund grant coming out of the state of Wisconsin for $189 million. We believe there's going to be a whole lot more out of them later, maybe this year. What they're talking about is coming out with grants that would be matching grants for some of the federal grants. There's also just a ton of little grants around. There's grants for schools and libraries, healthcare. There's grants for electric smart grid. There's also grants for things like broadband training. There's grants to get computers in people's houses. So this is the year of grants. I think as we said earlier, I think it's raining grants right now. So it's kind of crazy. So this was our list of next steps in the study. We delivered this back in October or November. And so you all have actually moved past this. And, so Steve has an updated list, but, we are strongly recommending a collaborative effort. There's a real economy of scale for all parts of the county working together. That doesn't mean you have to get one ISP to serve the whole county, but it means making sure, if you want to make sure everybody gets it, the way to do that is to work together, which doesn't just mean geographically, it means bringing in the electric company and the co-ops, and it means bringing in, the existing ISPs there. It means bringing in schools, libraries, everybody contributing to make this thing work. So I'm sure Steve will talk about, Steve's already said that there's a lot of work to be done. So that's the staffing resources we were talking about. We were talking about not running the business, but getting this thing moving, reaching out to ISPs, because that you have to have an ISP to get this done. I mean, you could be your own ISP, but it's harder to win the grants if the government wants to be an ISP and you never have been before. It's way easier to partner with somebody. Again, get creative and seeking grants. There's a ton of them. The survey I did was online survey, so it's not statistically valid. We got a lot of responses. The responses were so overwhelmingly in one direction that we think there's a lot of validity into them. But you're going to, before anybody would actually spend 133 million, you would do some more surveys. The trouble is you can't do one survey, one valid survey for a study as big as yours, because the different parts of the county have very different characteristics. And so it would actually be a series of surveys. Be prepared if the challenge the FCC maps. We've identified that some of the ISPs, we showed you their real speeds on that one chart. A lot of them claim that they have speeds faster than 25.3. And the reason they do that is so that they can potentially fight you from getting grants. We think in this case, you have a very good story to tell that those speeds there's definitely not a 25.3, but you'll have to be prepared to do that. That's just part of the grant process. Local policies related to fiber construction. We heard that you had a lot of policies against towers, and that kind of made us worried that you might have other policies in place that make it hard to build other things. So this is the time to look at that. We don't want to wait till it's time to build it and find out that the policies are terrible. And that's things like permitting and inspections, all the things that the local communities do when somebody builds fiber. Educating the public. This presentation tonight is one of the many stages of doing that. Lobby the state for more broadband grants. This is their chance to throw money at it. And then, there are other gaps. I mean, this is also the time to really think about getting some of those grants for training people how to use the internet and getting computers and those sort of things. So there is our contact information. And I guess we're going to open up the floor to questions or discussion, or I guess next we're handing it back to Steve here first. So.
And Doug, this is Dean. I just noticed that contact, that first letter should be a D instead of an A, or my contact.
Oh, I have the email address wrong.
Yeah.
Well, we already used this once before. No wonder no one calls you. We'll
Ken,
fix that.
Go ahead and open it.
Yeah, we'll fix that. Yeah.
Ken, you want to go ahead and open it for questions?
Sure. So we'll do it two ways. Obviously, there's people that are here in the meeting themselves. I have an extra mic. So if you have a question, we can take a question that way. Likewise, if there are those individuals that are online, you can two ways. If you're dialed in, you can hit *9. Or what you can do is there's on this thing, it says raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, what I will do is I will, unmute you, and then you can ask the question. So the first one, Nate Bell, I'm going to move you into the queue to allow to talk. When I move you into talk, it's going to move you into the thing, but you should be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. So Nate, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Technology works once in a great while.
Yes.
So one of the things I want to state is, one, I do believe that this project is imminent. I think it's going to take longer than anybody wants it to, inevitably, but I think it's going to happen. I guess the thing that I would point out is we have all the communities in Door County face a number of crisis level issues going on right now. And I am not speaking against doing this by any means, but I'm saying there's going to be an unintended consequence of moving ahead with this plan. We are having an extreme issue with housing. And I know that somebody on the surface would say, well, what does housing have to do with broadband? People, for the very reasons, the benefits of this will bring in more people to do more remote work, which will put more effort on our housing stock. So what I guess I'm saying is to all the municipal elected officials out there, we need to make sure that we move across multiple fronts, not just this, because this is going to potentially have another unintended consequence, benefit, you might say, but it also could have some very other real issues on there. And again, I'm not speaking against this. I'm just saying, let's make sure that we, as elected officials, keep that in mind and make sure we move the ball across a very broad front, not just this. But again, I can't say enough that I'm not speaking against this. I'm just saying that this is going to have an unintended consequence. And largely, this is going to be a good thing. And any other time in Door County's history, this would be an entirely a good thing. But right now, we do have that other issue floating out there.
This is Doug Dawson. I would like to react to that because I would actually add another issue. One of the things we heard from all of the innkeepers and all is that your tourist population is aging because young people don't want to come to the county because they don't have any broadband. And I, as the father of a 22-year-old, I can tell you that's exactly how it works. And so another consequence is if you give her good broadband everywhere, you're going to start getting a lot of younger folks, and that's going to also change the nature of the tourism. So there's always secondary consequences. You're absolutely right. So
I would agree with that on the tourism front, but I would say right now, there's very few people that can afford, you know, I'm 41 years old and there's almost nobody my age that can afford to live in to move into Northern Door County. You know, I've lived here for 25 years and that's why I'm here. I couldn't move here today. But yeah, and I unfortunately, tech jobs are really well-paying jobs, and that's the kind of folks you're gonna pull in here. But yes, there's this. Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Okay, thank you, Nate, for that. Next question, maybe for Dean or both of you would be just, I'll do both questions at once. The first one is, does the study actually include Washington Island? And then the second question is there was no mention of Starlink, and how does Starlink play into this discussion?
Dean first on Washington Island. Go ahead.
So the answer is the numbers that were presented and the designs that were completed included Washington Island, but is it Connors Island off to the northern coast of Door County was not included?
Chambers.
Island.
Yeah, okay.
Chambers Island.
Chambers Island, that's correct.
Yeah. The issue, and I'll address Starlink. The issue with Starlink is one is it's turning out that it doesn't look like it does very good in places with trees, and so it's not going to be a universal solution in the county. But there's already people there today who had it. We ran across a few folks who already are trying it, so you already have some test customers there because they're everywhere, and so it's a good solution if you can get it. The other issue they have is they're not going to be able to serve everybody. There's a real limitation on when they look down at a given piece of geography of how many homes they can serve. And as I told you, some of your rural areas, we think of them as rural, but they're still somewhat concentrated. And so they literally could not serve everybody. It's a good solution. It's not a solution for everybody. And it's certainly not a solution that could solve your broadband problems. You know, they simply could not begin to serve that many homes. But you know, they're certainly going to grab customers. They're also not cheap at $99 a month. A lot of people can't afford them. If I lived in a rural area, I would be fighting like crazy to get them. So I mean, I like their solution. So
Can I follow up on the Washington Island? Because one of the important things that we need to understand is the electric co-op is right in the midst of a major broadband fiber project. And so they're well on their way to getting fiber to premises throughout the island. And so they're somewhat ahead of the rest of the peninsula. And so it would make no sense to actually look at design on that island right now because they're well into their project and moving very quickly.
well, and you had asked us to put them in because that sort of gave them a second look at the cost. We have the cost of the rest of the county without them also.
Yeah.
I mean, so we already have those numbers. Yeah. I mean, I mean, it made sense to give, because essentially we gave them a second opinion of cost. So yeah, but we do have the numbers for everybody except them, so.
Okay, another question is can you describe what the building or what the build out looks like for fiber? What physical building will be needed beyond adding the existing pole needs? Reference is made to having policies that do not get in the way of building of the fiber.
Dean?
Yes, so with today's modern electronics, a lot of it has become very miniaturized. And so the remote equipment that I talked about, the cabinets that would be placed out throughout the county to pick up customers, those boxes are about the size of a refrigerator, 2 foot square, and about 5 to 6 feet tall at the most. And so those would be distributed throughout the county in areas that hopefully isn't an eyesore for someone. As far as the central location, we kind of left, we allocated money for it. We didn't designate where it was going to go. A lot of that's going to really depend on who the ISP is. The other part of this too is to remember that the goal of the design was to create an opinion of cost. And think of the design as something like a bunch of marbles in a tray. We have so many marbles in the tray, and if we move one of the points around, the rest of them shift to accommodate it, but it really doesn't change the cost. And when do we get to a design this large? So we didn't say, okay, your central core is going to go in this location and we need this kind of building. We just said, here's what it typically costs to put that in. A lot of those will be nailed down, like I said, when an ISP is selected, and they may already have facilities there limiting the need for that location. In terms of regular deployment of the facilities, probably our largest issue to deal with is what's called make ready work on the existing poles. So much of your island has aerial plant. We did not call for any new poles. We simply got the information from the electrical providers in the area that gave us the locations of their poles and allowed us to design based on that. So you have a lot of stuff already on those poles, and some of those are getting full. And so the biggest impact you will see there is another line in the sky, so to speak. And then you will also see poles changed out because they're either full or not tall enough to carry another provider below the existing ones. There is, like I said, about 20% buried plant. A lot of that will be done with cable plows or directional boring rigs, both of which leave a relatively minimal impact to the environment. In terms of impediments, typically what we find within the local communities is the amount of time it takes or the cost it takes to prepare and receive a construction permit from the local governmental entity that has control over that area. So as Doug mentioned earlier on, anything that can be done to speed up that process, because in essence, any cost will be borne by the county because it's just simply added to the cost of building the network. And I guess hopefully I got all of the points you had asked about in that question.
I would add one more. All the folks who get buried drops will tell you that they hated the fact that you cut their sprinkler system and dug up their daffodils. So you get those kind of complaints. Roads have a public right of way, but everyone has decided that's part of their yard and they plant stuff in it. And it's like, hey, that doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to the city or the county. But so we have those kind of issues with the buried part. Nobody's going to mind another aerial drop to their house. There's no issues with those. But the people who do have the buried ones, and most of the buried ones are in the towns, and so but still those issues. There's always that public relations issue with bury and drops. So yep.
Okay, I got about 5 questions in the queue, so bear with me. I'm just going to ask one at a time. The first question is, if the price per passing is reasonable, why is an ISP not already investing at even the basic level?
Well, I happen to be a finance guy. I'm a numbers guy for a living. You know, the fact is, to build everywhere is $133 million. there's really not that many ISPs out there who can raise that money on their own. All the, the big telcos have walked away for years. The reason your broadband is so bad in the rural areas is that all three of those telcos stopped caring about it 20 years ago. So they're not going to invest in it out of their own money. The littler telcos, most of the little telcos, even around the state, the guys you think of who are fairly big, they can't raise that much money. They couldn't even do just your county, let alone the rest of the state. That's a giant loan for a small company to borrow. And so the issue is raising the money. It's really difficult to raise that kind of money. If you have a couple ISPs there in a county, if you went to Door County Broadband and said, could you guys raise 133 million? I don't know how long it would take them to stop laughing. But he's not untypical. They all have exactly the same issue. That's a giant amount of money. But there are places where they have done it. There are counties around the country where somebody has done it. There's not enough people to do it everywhere. There just is not enough. So,
and Doug, I guess I would add to that. If we look at the large entities that were there, and we won't name any names, but this exists pretty much across the realm, is if they look at investing $1, if they invest that $1 in the rural, the return is much lower than if they invest that same $1 in the large municipal areas that they serve. And so that's basically where the money's going. Their return on investment is better.
Yeah, I mean, AT&T stopped even serving DSL in the county, but AT&T is going to build 25 million homes with fiber, but they're all going to be in cities. They're not going to be in Door County. So. Yep.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. This is Steve. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this study is to begin to build the business case for ISPs to look at service in Door County. So the price per passing is it's an estimate, but it goes back to something Doug mentioned, is each one of these service areas are going to have to do a statistically valid survey to get a real feeling for what that penetration is going to look like in each one of those areas, which will be of immense interest to the ISPs for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and the other reason, the other good news out of the study is if you can get those grants, it makes it a lot more attractive. And so, the point is this is an opportunity to finally make it an attractive commercial entity. But even with those grants, the ISPs are still going to have trouble raising all the money. I mean, this is not, that is by far the number one challenge is the money. So.
Okay, two-part question. Does the study at all look at the infrastructure leaving Door County and the connection to the rest of the world? And the second part of the question is, in the design, does it already look at some existing fiber installed in a county like Ensight?
Okay, I can take that. The answer to the first question is that though it was not directly studied, I live and work in Wisconsin. I'm over in the Eau Claire area, and I am very familiar with a lot of the major carriers and their fiber routes. There really isn't an issue for fiber passing Door County, and to a certain degree, there really isn't much of an issue with getting fiber into the county. It all exists. It just depends on who owns it and what they want to do with it. Speaking directly to, could you read the second part of the question again, please?
Well, in the design concept, did you look at potential existing fiber installed in a county like Ensight?
So the answer is no, and the reason being is a couple of which. A lot of the existing fiber that's in the county was designed to go from point to point, and so as a result, when we look at a fiber to the home study, that fiber is tapped, so to speak, every several hundred feet to every 500 feet to serve a customer. In order to do that, you have to have extra fiber available in what we call a slack coil that allows you to literally cut off the outside of the cable, expose the individual fibers and access them to splice onto a fiber that goes to the customer's premise. And then that whole mess is bundled back up into what we call a splice case or a container. And you may have seen them as you go down the roads. They're about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, about 3 feet long, and they're black. And they're hanging off the spans of the cables. So if you don't have that slack fiber, it's very hard to serve individual people going by. The other of which is that those cables were designed with much smaller counts than may be required to serve every customer where they get their own dedicated fiber as it goes along. Now there's some splitter technologies that overcomes that, but that comes in its own set of challenges. What we mostly count that existing fiber for is that's the fiber that would be used to express traffic back out of the county to the rest of the world. And in a lot of cases, when we look at that, an individual fiber, they're starting to find the limits as to how much capacity it has, but it's up into the thousands of terabits, which is a huge, huge number of capacity. It'll support, 2 fibers could support your entire county.
Okay, next question. Has We Energies or WPS been part of the study to date? In other words, do we know that We Energies will allow fiber under poles and at what cost? And then the second part of the question is, what is the realistic time frame from this point in time to connect to a home, best and worst case scenario?
You take the first one, I'll take the second one, Dean.
Okay, so the answer is Wisconsin law and the utility requirements is that if somebody wants to attach to a pole, there's provisions in the Wisconsin law and the federal law that makes that happen. Probably the bigger barrier though is that if the pole is full, and let's just say there's a 35-foot pole in place and there's 4 people already on it, including the power company, when you go to be the 5th person, which you would be, that pole is going to be too short. And so you're going to have to change that out and put a taller pole in. They're going to let you do it, but it's the last person to the party that pays the dinner bill, so to speak. And so what ends up happening is sometimes it's not the permission issue, although, sometimes that's awful slow in coming. It's the cost issue of, can you afford to replace all those poles?
Yeah, so, and the second question, if you built the whole county, that's almost 1,600 miles of fiber. You're not going to build that in a year. That's a really big, especially, you don't always work all the winter there. Right now it's snowing. And so we're thinking that's a 3, and in the study, I think we have that as a 3 or even maybe a 4-year build out. These grants are expecting you to take 3 or 4 years to build. And even after you do that, have the fiber up and down the 1,600 miles, it's another 3 or 4 years till everybody gets added on. So our study assumes that it would take around 6 to 7 years to get all the customers on the network. Now, some customers would be added at the end of the first year. I mean, everybody, as it gets built, people start getting put onto it. But it's a slow process. Now, if somebody came in with enough money and energy, you could probably get it done in 2 years. We rarely see that in a rural area. There would be so many crews, they would be crawling over top of each other. It'd be very hard to manage, but it can be done. And we actually have seen people who built large areas in a short period of time. That's not normal. So we're thinking 3.5, 4 years to build everything. And that would be very typical for here. So now, if multiple ISPs, again, it doesn't have to be one ISP that serves everybody. If 3 or 4 different ISPs each build a different part of the county, it would go much faster because each of them would be tackling their piece at the same time. So there's no real given answer. Once we know who the ISPs are and once we know how they're going to get funded, the timeline will be almost the first thing that we all figure out. So.
Okay, thank you for those that are sending in questions and those that are waiting. We'll get through the questions. We're just going to take a minute to go through them all, so please be patient. Next question is, has the study evaluated the potential for data centers in our industrial parks to bring in a high volume data users to help disperse the burden of the cost to the existing, and plus a way for the ISPs to be drawn to support the data centers?
We never assume, because those kind of assumptions can make the whole study look better. We just never assume that you're going to get some big customer on the network. Can you do that? Absolutely. And so that, and any ISP doing this may already have somebody in mind who would do that. So, but if we don't put those in studies because we want to be conservative. So if we came and said, oh yeah, you're going to get $2 million a year revenue out of a couple of these new data centers, you don't need very much grant. They're going to pay for it. we would be doing you a huge disservice. And so, and because of where you're at, you may not get any of them. You can't count on getting them. So you might get them, you might not get them. And so we don't put them in, but they're always a possibility. Absolutely. So.
Yeah, I can add to that. I've worked 2 data centers, and I can tell you that we would be the least desirable location for data centers for a lot of different reasons, not just whether or not you have, the capacity for fiber. There's a lot of factors that go into the decision now on data centers, none of which are in our favor.
Yeah, the number one issue is the cost of electricity. So that's they go to the cheapest electric places.
Yeah, you got cost of electricity, but you also have cooling capacities that you got to address, and then redundancy on every.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to transition this for one. I go, Derek, your hand's been raised. I have you unmuted. You have the floor for the question. If you unmute yourself.
Yeah, actually kind of going with the data center question, and based upon the graph that they had or the presentation. Now, is it required that a data center needs to be in the network? And if so, I guess the other question, because you guys were just saying about how sometimes it's like hard to get people in here, and that the attractiveness of it because of our location and the cost and stuff. And the other question is, does each ISP, like say if we do multiple ISPs, do we need one data center per each ISP? Can they all share one? Because I believe in the cost that was included for like one data center, I think. I'm not 100% sure. So I kind of wanted to ask that question on that aspect. And
it's a good question, because the first answer is when Dean used the word data center for that, he's really talking about the little network core for the ISP. That's nothing like a data center like Facebook would build. It's not the same thing at all. Facebook builds these things that look like Amazon warehouses. This thing here is going to fit in one pretty big room in a building somewhere. And so that it's really a core network. It's the core electronics that run the whole county. If you move that out to smaller ones, the cost is still not a whole lot more, because you would take all of that equipment and put some here and put some there. And so the answer is that, yeah, each ISP would have their own pile. If there's 3 or 4 ISPs, it wouldn't have had that much cost. The chances are, it could be somebody like Insight. They probably already have one of these. I mean, if Insight was one of the partners, for example. So there are already existing of these core networks in the county to start with. So the answer is we think our dollars are pretty good, whether it's one ISP or 4. And it's not the same kind of data center that we were just talking about. So
I would add to that, Doug, that in the case of Door County, virtually any ISP that you have come in will be from outside the county, with maybe some minor exceptions, but they already have a core network set up at their current location. And so we would actually be, in essence, creating data aggregation sites within Door County, not a full-fledged data center.
Right. If somebody had a data center, a core in Green Bay, then they wouldn't have to build all that here. A lot of it would be down there. Exactly. So
yeah,
right,
yeah, we would just aggregate traffic and get it 2 ways out.
Right.
Okay, another question is, what is the cost, or is there consideration for cutting rock for burial while running the fiber? And who does the locates, and who pays for the load rating, engineering poles, and the recurring pole rent?
I would do the last one. We do have the recurring pole rents. We talked to electric companies about their rates. Dean can answer the rest of them. So
yep. So that's the primary reason why the rock is the primary reason why Door County is mostly aerial. It is, you guys have hard rock. It is not the soft sandstone that we find in other parts of the states. And so there really isn't much for trenching it. And that's why you have so much aerial facilities. Where it is buried, we would hope to be able to bury also. That's always not entirely successful. And in some of those cases, it may be cheaper to go back to aerial than it would be to bury. So it's all worked into the model. We've accounted for some of that, but the whole purpose here would be is if we run across rock, unless there's a prohibition against it, we would probably go back aerial.
Okay, and I'm going to kind of combine these two questions. And I can do it more for just a general thing, but has the county itself considered doing dark fiber themselves and offering grants for the ISPs to utilize it? And then likewise, does the county have the bonding capacity? I'd say the county or communities have the bonding capacity to fund this.
That's not a question for Dean or I, so.
Well, I guess the one question I would have is that or if you guys could clarify, I believe there's some restrictions in terms of Wisconsin, in terms of, I guess, government entities becoming a utility provide. I know it's been a question is why don't the municipalities become not so much a utility, but a ISP provider themselves? And I know there's some restrictions on that, is there not?
There are some restrictions, but they're more like what we call hindrances to get in the business. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, but there are some communities in the state that have already done it. So you're not prohibited, but it sort of adds another 6 months or a year to the front of it to go through all these legal steps. You have to have formal hearings and put out bids, and it's just a whole lot of hoops to jump through. So you could do it. Most communities who do that anyhow would still try to find an ISP partner. And most of our communities who are paying for networks, they do a public-private partnership where the local government, the city or county, still does actually build it, but they still get an ISP to run it. And if you do that, then all those legal restrictions are not there anymore. So, there's, but for the county or the cities to do it themselves, yeah, there would be some extra hoops to jump through, but they're definitely something that could be done. So,
okay. When it's all said and done, what does this transition look like and feel for the average consumer? A new service choice with their existing ISP, a performance upgrade without any action needed, or a new choice of an ISP to sign up for?
well, if one of the existing ISPs were to do this upgrade, then they would probably just move people over to the new network. If it's a new outside guy doing it, or if it's someone who's doing it in a neighborhood they're not serving, that's going to be a new choice. The chances are it's mostly going to be a new choice. Nobody has this really fast broadband anywhere. So like in the towns, Charter's not going to be the one building the fiber to compete with their own network. So it's going to be a new choice. So.
All right, thank you. Has licensed wireless technology been considered as a fill-in for high rural areas where the density does not justify fiber builds at this time?
So this is Dean, I'll take that one. We looked at wireless as a fill-in and maybe temporary, but the amount of money invested and the return that it would provide really didn't take you very far forward. Your terrain and actually density is working somewhat against you. A lot of the radios today can't handle the number of people that you have within a given area. And so it was looked at and we realized that there was no strong path forward from that point. You would invest the money and within a short period of time, you would be having to invest more to make it work.
Okay. Aren't schools and libraries already on fiber networks from the past broadband grant?
Yes, they are. They do have broadband. Yep.
Next question is, what makes this different than Brilliant Cities?
I don't know what Brilliant Cities is.
They're defunct.
Yeah.
I don't think you want to go there.
Yeah, there's something I would have to go and look at that. I've heard that name before. I will say that I've heard it. I don't. I'm going to have to say I can't answer that question right now. If it's what I'm thinking it is, I don't think it's where we want to go.
Absolutely not.
Okay, that's currently the questions that have come in online. Is there anyone else on the online who'd like to raise their hand or submit a question? Or is there anyone in the room that'd like to ask a question? I have another mic I can put up. Anyone in the room? Quick question.
I'm Dave Greco from Bailey's Harbor. Question is, with respect to the make ready, get ready, and the poles, has there been work done to maybe estimate the number of poles that may have to be replaced or enhanced versus what we'd be able to leverage currently? And is that baked into the estimates?
Without driving every inch of the county and evaluating every pole, we did our best guess. And I don't know if I want to use the word guess, but our best opinion as to what those make ready costs would be. It could be that we got lucky and we hit the good spots, but you saw how many spots we hit within the county. The other thing that may come into play is we tried to best estimate the cost of the make ready as part of the percentage. And so we have looked at it. The devil will be in the details though, as we dig into actually building a system this size.
Okay. I did have another question come in. It says, with the infrastructure lines going to the schools and libraries, does that help us with this project?
You're going to hate that. You're going to hate this answer. What you're going to find out is there's a lot of fiber in the county today. The electric company has fiber, Charter has fiber, the schools have fiber. There's actually Insight has fiber. First off, a lot of that fiber, as Dean said, was middle mile fiber. So it's not really usable for getting to homes, but there's a worse problem with things like the school fiber, because the chances are the grants that helped to pay for those probably had a prohibition against those fibers being used for commercial purposes. And so those fibers, even if they were able to do that, the chances are probably 90% plus that they would not be allowed to compete with private ISPs. So there's actually quite a bit of fiber in the county that is absolutely non-usable, either because of its middle mile or because of these really weird financial and legal restrictions, or it's private. It's just, the owner doesn't want to use it for this. And so, which is certainly their choice. So, the chances are the school fiber wouldn't help at all. It's really unbelievable. You would think that you could serve the 50 houses around the school easily. You probably cannot. So.
And this is Dean. One quick clarification in addition to my previous question, and that was for Door County, we used a much higher than normal make ready cost than we would have in a lot of our other studies. So we did use a higher than average cost, much higher than average cost.
Okay, another question came in. Could broadband deployment damage the views, picturesque views, such as a nuisance, light, noise on poles?
No, there's no noise from fiber, not a bit. So, no. I mean, yeah, you've got the nuisance during the day when they're building on your street. That's about it. So.
And I would say that the minor irritation of if you had 4 lines in the sky, you now have 5. But in the overall scheme of things, the fiber deployment is a very thin line compared to copper deployments or coaxial deployments.
Yeah. Right now you have the really big electric and telephone wires. This is much smaller wire. Yeah. So.
Okay. Last call for any questions. If not, we still have about another item to go over with. If you guys don't mind, we'll transition to that because we'll take another round of questions if there is anything that's left. So one of the things that, since the study's been completed, we've been working with a committee just to kind of figure out what the next steps would be from that work of the study. And we'd like to share that. And what I'm referring to is a file that was sent out to all the communities that were online. And I also handed it out here tonight, but I will also share it. So if you just give me 1 second to transition to share the screen on our end. So those that are online can see it. And I don't know. I guess
we can see we can see it. Yep.
Okay, because it's not showing up on my screen here, but I know I have it as a handout. There we go. So if you don't mind, we'd like to maybe take a minute, maybe just to go over this in terms of our next steps. And I handed all the ones out. I have my one somewhere with notes somewhere. Doesn't make a difference. What we try to do is, as the study had mentioned, we talked about this being an effort that we all have to be involved in. So this is what we're trying to work with the municipalities so they understand where this is going to be going in the future. So again, in the first page, obviously, we have the key findings and recommendations. There's also this a little diagram of what we perceive as all the major players moving forward in terms of this deployment of the technology. Then across the bottom of the diagram, it really talks about those players and what we think some of those key roles are for each one of those players. Again, this will change over time. But again, it just gives you an idea of what we think we're doing in terms of the communities. So for example, your towns, villages, and cities, there's obviously the local project planning, having those discussions with a potential ISP, educating your residents, completing those statistical surveys, then obviously working with grants and ultimately implementation. So that's a lot of work to be done at the local level, if you can imagine. But again, what we're trying to do is just kind of give you that vision of how this study, I guess, comes back to each local community. So again, I don't want to read every single thing out, but again, we're just trying to show that this truly is going to be a collaborative effort and we all have a certain role to play to make this work. If you then go to, I guess, the back, what we're trying to do then is actually say, well, what can we do as we start to gear everything up? So again, we just put together just a tentative 90-day timeline in terms of things that we think that can be done to continue moving this forward. And each one of those areas we're talking about, what can we be doing to move this and keep this moving forward? As Steve had mentioned, and also as part of the presentation, some of those bigger grants are coming up later this year. And it really behooves us to start moving forward, to start getting prepared for those, so that way we can apply for some of those grants. So really, since obviously our target audience tonight is our local municipalities, I think one of the things that really stands out would be the towns, cities, and villages. And one of the key recommendations, obviously from the study, is make sure that you have the opportunity to review the study. The one thing that we think that's critical is that each entity create a local fiber net or / broadband committee. That could be, assigned onto an existing committee, or you can form up a new one. But we do think that that's critical, that you have a body in place that's specifically looking and talking about this and would be willing to, I guess, work with other communities, but also the county in trying to move this forward in terms of that initiative. Then again, we kind of talked about that before, but obviously there's, in the future, as you start moving forward, there could be a community assessment. You also might be ready to consider some applying for grants. Already the first ones, I think, coming up at March in terms of the timing. And then obviously the communication through this entire process is critical. The other area that I think is very important that we're trying to do is at the county level is look at how can we facilitate that process overall. And that's where the partnership with the Economic Development Corporation and the county and all of our partners, we've been trying to figure out how to move that forward. So one of the things that we'll be doing is looking for hiring a project coordinator. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to try to use some of the county federal dollars that are allocated through the American Recovery Act dollars to actually fund that position. And with that, we're also hoping to, I guess, create a committee that'd be composed of the key stakeholders. So that way we can start coordinating all these efforts. So if you can imagine, a community, for example, could be working on a project and putting together a grant, but ultimately all these communities at some point in time need to connect. And I think that's what we need, is that coordination to make sure that we're all talking and that ultimately we're not wasting money or missing opportunities and really trying to maximize our effectiveness for getting grants. So really from that standpoint, the one thing we're trying to stress is that we're really looking at a coordinator to kind of help facilitate all that. It's not anything where we're trying to take any type of ownership or any of that type of responsibility away from the local units of government, but really trying to bring this together and really maximize how we're going to move forward together. I guess the other thing just to point out in terms of this, we did again identify what we consider the major stakeholders and what we think their role would be over the next 90 days. The reason why we kind of just went with the 90 days is that's just a time frame for us. Obviously, we're thinking of rolling this out. This is our first meeting to the public and our municipal partners in terms of this study. There'll be another one that we're hoping to do that's more open to the public in the future as well, still in January, hopefully. But again, in terms of some of these recommendations, obviously it needs to go through our county process to see if we can leverage some of those funds and actually try to get a project coordinator on board. So again, the whole idea is just to kind of say that, yes, the study is done. There's a lot of information in there that we have to distill, but there's still a lot of things that we can start preparing for and start working on. And I guess we wanted to share that with you tonight. And then as this starts to move forward, we're hoping that at your local level, that at your town boards or city or villages, you have those meetings to actually put that on your agenda and discuss the plan and discuss maybe forming a committee. And our goal is to reach out with you to see who those key stakeholders will be in terms of our communications in the future. But then likewise, you can also monitor, I guess, our progress at the county level. We'll be looking for, I guess, your support into the county to say, yes, that we think that's a priority of where we think we should use some of those American Recovery Fund dollars in terms of trying to move this forward as well. So that's a quick overview. I don't know, Steve, if you wanted to add anything in terms of some of the content or any other things that you think I missed. Steve, are you there yet? Or did I get you muted?
No, there were a couple of questions that came up about sharing the second page. I don't know if you saw those, Ken.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And there was a question about, will this presentation be online for the community? Yes, it will, through the FiberNet website. There is a website under development where we will post all the documents for people to access, to read. There'll be an ability for someone to post a question and someone will get back to you to answer those questions. But I think this is a great start. I think we're going back to one of the comments that I believe Doug made early in the presentation. This is not going to be possible without collaboration across the county with all the partners. And so this is a great start. This has tremendous benefits. I will agree with Nate. There are other issues that we have to address, particularly on the affordable workforce housing side, and that's certainly being addressed. But we find ourselves having to do address concurrent issues, this being one, housing being the other, childcare. They're all important and they can't be sequential. They have to be concurrent. So I think there were great questions tonight.
Okay, there was another question that came up is, will the network be fully redundant, or could a single cut such as someone excavating or digging up in their yard have a huge impact on the quality of the network?
I can go ahead and grab that. And the answer is there will be portions of the network that are dedicated to individual people and that will not be redundant. The technology and the cost to do so doesn't really exist today. So if you go back to my presentation where we showed the community and the houses, I don't know if Doug, if we pick that up quick?
I'll turn off my sharing. 1 second.
It's one with the house symbols on it. Keep going back up just
Keep
to the
going.
stick diagram. Yep. It's
That
the
one?
cartoon drawing right there. So in the network where you see the individual houses, we'll look at the upper left. There's a dedicated fiber that goes all the way to this local convergence cabinet. And any design, whether it's GPON or active, if you get a fiber cut and anywhere along that route, the customers that are on that cable will lose service. There really isn't a solution that resolves that. And in one respect, that's no different than the copper cables you have today. Once you hit the local conversions cabinet, if it's an electronic node, then we would have placed a way to have redundant routes out of that. If it's a splitter cabinet, then if you take a look to the thicker red line that goes to the left towards the central office, I labeled as a data center, but that's maybe overstating a little bit. If that cable is cut, everybody that is downstream from that point loses service. In the case of Door County, we had 20 some electronic nodes. All of those nodes, there'd be a cabinet-sized data center, so to speak, would have redundant routing out. So at any given point, we find it unlikely that more than 200 to 400 people maximum would ever be out of service. But that's actually better than you are today.
True. Are there any other questions online? Any other questions from the group in the room at all? Yes, sir.
Yes, my name,
Sure.
my name is Chuck Shuckle from Liberty Grove. And the question I have in listening to the presentation has to do with the ISP. And obviously the ISP is a critical factor in getting this project going. But am I understanding from what you said a few times that it's really the ISP is going to take charge of the whole build out of the network? With obvious support from the communities and so on, but is it effectively going to be their network, or is if the county or municipalities provide funding, is it going to be the county or municipalities network and therefore provide future changes to the ISP?
You just answered your own question. Whoever pays for it's going to control it. It's really that simple. So if you all bonded 100% for it and hired somebody to run it, it would be yours to run and operate, and you set the rules. If they 100% pay for it, they're going to do it their way. If it's a partnership, you're going to work out somewhere in the middle, and you'll have some sort of input to their way they run their business. So it all comes down to who pays for it, and that's kind of true of all businesses, but it's very true of fiber networks. So. And what you may get is, Village A may build their own, and Village B may have the ISP build. You're not going to get one solution everywhere. So
I think that what we'll learn through the process, like, for example, we had the Towns Association meeting, and obviously this is our municipal meeting, but we do have some people that are further along in the process, like the town of Washington, and also the town of Bailey's is also, I guess I consider a little bit ahead of everyone else in terms of doing their research. So the nice thing about having those individuals that are in the lead are also the ones that are running into some of those obstacles and some of those questions and solutions. And I think obviously their goal is to share their success and failures with everyone else. So I think that's one of the things that we think we want to leverage, is making sure that, especially once I get the coordinator on board, that we're sharing those opportunities and those ideas. And again, even when we come to agreements and those types of things, I think all of those things will be made available, because again, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel and trying to get this done. So I think there's some great opportunities for us to work together, even though a lot of this will be done at the local level. We'll be able to share that throughout the county. So with that, are there any other questions? So just to kind of wrap things up, there's two things, I guess, left. I guess this, again, a reminder, I guess, from our standpoint. Again, the target, obviously, with our municipal partners was just to kind of share the study, but then also the next steps. So really, I guess what we would like to ask is that you at least put this on your agenda. Hopefully you can take this 2-pager and sit down with your committees and have that discussion, and try to determine or take some of those steps moving forward. And then likewise, you'll hear more from the county and also DCEDC in terms of how we're going to try to move forward in terms of leveraging the coordinator and also trying to move the project moving forward. I guess with that, I don't know if David, if you're still online, I know it's been almost a year since we actually had what we consider our municipal meeting. Usually the county, we try to host at least 2 or 3 of these during the year. Obviously, COVID, I guess, changed that. So it was nice for us to quote unquote get together, both virtually and those that were able to come. But I don't know, Dave, if you wanted to add anything in closing?
In closing, I just want to give a big shout out and a thank you, obviously, to Steve and Doug and Dean as we initially start to move forward with this. And we're looking forward to our continued interaction and hopefully soon local meetings to continue to expand this.
All right, thank you, David. Anything else from anyone else on the panel? Nope. I guess with that, we will conclude the meetings. For those that are online, thank you for attending. And for those that are here, please drive safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good evening.